Welcome to today's tutorial. We'll be going through Practical 8's memo because apparently you guys were told that Practical 8 is similar to how it's going to be in uh, how the questions are going to be structured in semester test 2. So I didn't know that I was wondering why everyone is like, yeah, can you please do a memo for Practical 8? I'm like, there's really not much of a difference as long as it's code, yeah, for doing file handling. I guess students still have the tendency of wanting to copy or wanting to cram code just because Mr. Ofao said, yeah, it's going to be similar. It's not necessarily going to be exactly the same thing, but it's going to be similar. Remember, they're going to be talking about a different problem. Maybe in your semester test two, they were talking about planets. Maybe, yeah, you never know. Maybe paper A, you'll be planets. Paper B is about fruits. Totally unrelated. So it doesn't really matter whether you cram or not. The important thing is understanding. So I'm going to name this project Informatics 1B Practical 8 Memo 2024. And then I'm going to save it on desktop so that it's easier for me to locate it. Then create. Okay, it's loading. So there we go. And apparently we're going to need to use UJ Grid here. Let me see. Do I have it? I don't think so. Since I reinstalled Visual Studio, I don't think I have it. Yeah, it's not there. So let me add the UJ Grid. So I'm going to right click here and click choose items. And then it's going to take its precious time loading. While it's loading, let me drink some water. Okay, it's taking its precious time to load, so let me leave that while it loads. So, highly concerned with the poor administration of bursary funds, the Utopian Social Grants Department has approached you to develop a Visual Basic application that will assist them with managing and allocating the funds better for high school and university students. So it's a bursary allocation system, right? So we're allocating bursaries. That's the basic idea in a nutshell that's going on here. So let me see. Okay. So it's pretty much similar. Yeah, these things are similar. I guess the only confusing part is here, but it's not really confusing. You see what I mean by it's not confusing. So let me see how far. Okay, now it's now officially loading. So it hadn't started loading yet. Okay. To Visual Studios can be slow sometimes. Hey, and then file handling. Okay, we have random access files. Okay. Okay, yeah, you see, using the UJ grid, display the students that received funding, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, everything is important here. Every single thing is important here. Okay, so mm, come on, Visual Studio. Okay, it's done. So browse, and then I'm gonna go to, I hope I still have the folder. I think I still do. UJ grid, then UJ grid.dll. And then yes, because I want to load it, I trust that I'm loading the right thing, and then click OK, and then there's my UJ grid, but I want to move it down here. Yeah, under general. So I'm going to put it there, and we're going to need it some point. So I'm going to drag it here. So there's my UJ grid. And then, so I'm going to do this. It depends on how many things I'm supposed to display. I'm not really sure. We'll see as we go on, right? So let's start creating our classes. So I'm going to click on Solution Explorer, and then I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to say add a new class. And then here at the bottom, it's going to show me, then I need to write the name. We have a student class, right? Because remember, this is a bursary allocation for students. And then I'm going to have my option statements here. So option strict on, so that I can cast on my own or convert on my own, and then option explicit on, so that I can declare my variables on my own. And then option, what's the other one? Option infer off, so that I can declare my local variables on my own. Then we're going to have instance variables, right? Remember, comments have marks, so we need to put our comments. So underscore full name, which is the name of the student applying for the bursary, but it's a full name, meaning it includes the name, first name, middle name, and last name. And then they said the maximum should be 15 characters. So it's code underscore full name. So private, remember for security reasons, it has to be private. So underscore full name as a string. But then this string needs to be fixed, right? So VB fixed string of size 15, right? It's going to be of size 15 because they told you that the maximum should be 15. So we set it we set the maximum to be 15 by using VB fixed string. So we need to also create this variable. So I'm just for the sake of not having to type everything, I'm just going to cut and paste the variable names. So student number representing the student applying for the bursary. This should be limited to 9 characters maximum. So it's actually a string because they're telling us it's characters. So it's still the same thing. We're using VB string since the data type for this student number is a string. Contrary to what you believe in, that, oh, maybe since it's a student number, it needs to be saved as an integer. Well, not really. You only save it as an integer if you're going to do mathematical calculations on it. You'll understand that when you do databases next year in Informatics 2A. That student number shouldn't be saved as actually an integer, but instead as a string. And another reason for why you save it as a string is that if you write a number like this in code 09, VB just ignores the 9 and views it as a 9. So hence we can't save the 9. So that's why we have to actually make it a string so that we can represent all numbers. And on top of that, we're not going to use the student number to perform mathematical calculations. Like I'm not going to get a remainder on a student number. I'm not going to do all those calculations. So I don't have to save it as an integer. But yeah, I don't have to. Yeah, okay, we have a record structure for that, for file handling. Remember, when you're dealing with random access files, you need to multiply by the size of the record structure. So in that scenario, it has to be, or we can, okay, it's fine. There's a way to do that, but even though it might look redundant, but there's a way. So nummarks, which is an integer value. You see, they tell you if it's an integer. An integer value representing the number of marks that the student has. So private underscore nummarks as integer, which represents the number of marks that the student has. Basically, I would say this is the number of practicals. It shouldn't actually be called num marks. It should be actually num practicals. If, for example, we were representing an informatics 1 B student. But in this case, it's just a generic student, just a student. So that they couldn't come up with another word, a name for it. They just called it num marks. So an integer, then we have underscore marks, which I'm just going to be lazy and copy the name. An integer array representing the marks as percentages. That means between 0 and 100. Any invalid entry should be set to 0. So this is very important. We need a helper method for that. So I'm going to say private underscore. It's an array of integers as integer. And we know that the size is, its size is num marks. That's its size. When you have to resize it, we will know how big it should be. And then we have underscore average, which is a double representing the student's average mark. So I'm going to create that private as a double since we're going to be dividing. So we expect to get back at the double. And then underscore qualifies. Do you qualify? Yeah, this was a personal paper. Yeah, they're being very personal here. Yeah, so and whatever you write in this paper will also determine whether you actually do indeed qualify or not. So that's why I'm saying this was the personal thing. It was very personal. So underscore qualifies as Boolean, right? True or false. Meaning true, do you qualify, or false, you don't qualify. Okay, so let me fix that. Okay. So we have that, and then they told you that what appropriate property method should be created. So appropriate property method, they should be created. So let's see. So you should create property methods, right? But it depends on the methods, right? That's the thing, it depends. But since you were not told that it's a read only or a write only, they were not specific. What I advise you to do is that make it both. Just make it a normal property method. So methods, let's start with the constructor, our builder, right? To help us build the object. So public sub new. So this builder, what type of information does it take from our client or from our user? This builder takes in the parameters underscore. You see, enter them exactly as you've been required to enter them or to declare them. They said it accepts the parameters underscore. They are putting that underscore on purpose because they want to test you something. They want to know if you know the me keyword. So put it as it is. Don't be like, Marase, you told us that we shouldn't do that. Yeah, he did, but now this is a test, right? It needs to test your understanding. So they need to know that you know what the me keyword means. So you need three things: student number, which is also a string, and then last but not least, underscore num marks as an integer. Remember what I talked about? If let's initialize them, right? So let's start with underscore full name. So underscore full name is equals to underscore full name. Now Visual Basic will get confused. It will even give you a warning saying it's unnecessary because it thinks you are assigning that variable to itself. So to be able to distinguish between the two, you say the one on the left hand side, it's my full name, meaning it's part of the class. And then if you go over it, you see now there's no more errors. You see there's no more error because it now knows the difference. It knows this me, it means my full name, which means it's this one over here. And then the other one obviously can be the parameter. That's the only other one. So that's they were testing if you know the me keyword here. That's why they did it on purpose. Don't be like, Mara, say you said we shouldn't declare them like that. Well, he did, but remember this is a test. He's supposed to test your understanding, whether you've been paying attention the whole time when I was teaching in class. And then I'm going to resize. So I'm going to use the readdim, right, to resize my array, which is underscore marks. And then I'm going to set it to my num marks since it's now initialized, right? Me.num marks is now initialized. But then remember, this array will we won't be sure what values it has, so we should initialize it to zeros, right? So set the array values to be 0. So I'm going to say for I as integer is equals to 1 to me dot underscore nummarks. Remember, you're within this constructor. You can, if you omit the me keyword, it'll refer to the parameter, which is a problem. We want it to refer to the one inside of our class since we've already initialized it, right? So since we now initialize it, and we also allocated memory for array, we can now use it. So marks at index I set it to 0. So initializing our array to have 0 values in it because it might not be initialized. But the rule of thumb is that every class, whenever, I don't know in Visual Basic, but when you create a class and you don't initialize the variables or the array or whatever, it's automatically initialized to 0 most of the time, But sometimes it's not. So since it's like there's certain level of uncertainty, right? We can never be truly sure. Hence, we have to manually initialize them to 0. So, and another advice that I can give you, remember this constructor, right? Every time we create an object, we have to have this constructor. We have to pass those 3 parameters. That means in terms of my property methods, the only property methods I need are read-only property methods because the values are set via the constructor. I think that's why Mr. Ofao said use the appropriate. You see the keyword here? It's appropriate, the one that's appropriate, the one that should be created. You see, that should be created. Method should be created. So appropriate ones should be created. Don't just create a property method. Like I'm sure you won't lose too many marks. Maybe 1 mark per property method. You're gonna lose 1 mark, but they should all be read only. Because like I said, every time you remember to use this class, you have to instantiate it, meaning that this constructor has to be used, meaning that the full name, student number, and marks or num marks are always initialized when we instantiate the object. So we always set them via instantiation. But now our instance variable, these variables, they need a way to be accessed. So we need to access them. Setting them is not a problem. We set them via the constructor. But now we need to be able to access them, meaning that we need to be able to read. So we need read-only property methods. So I don't have to put that comment. So I'm going to say property, okay, it's public because it has to be public. It has to be accessed by the public, right? Public property, the property name is full name as string. But remember, it's not just public property, it's public read only property method. And then, yeah, Visual Basic, sometimes Visual Studio sometimes doesn't autocomplete, so you have to remember it. So I should return the underscore full name. And then you see within here, right, there's no other underscore full name. So it's redundant for me to use the me keyword. You can use it, it's fine. You see, me.keyword, but if you pay close attention, right, look at this color. It's a bit lighter, right? And then this one is a bit bold. Meaning that when it's a bit lighter, it means that it's redundant, it's not necessary. And then here it was bold because it is necessary. So I'm gonna omit that me keyword. I don't have to specify because there's no other conflicting name or something else that's named exactly underscore full name. And then public read only property. What else do we need? Student number, right? So student number as a string. And then end property. Come on, and then it's a get statement because we're only accessing. In C++, this is what we call accessors, right? Read only. In C++, the read only part, it's that const keyword at the end for those doing C++. Remember, these things are exactly the same thing. The only difference is syntax. And then read only property. Yeah, remember, you might be like, yeah, well, C++, why you keep referring to C++? I want you to see that nothing's new under the sun. It's exactly the same thing. The difference is syntax. And you're actually saying the exact same thing as you did in C++. What do I mean by the only difference is syntax? Syntax is like a different way of saying that's exact same thing. It's like, for example, what was that? What's that word? Okay, I forgot it. But yeah, it's like saying sawubona in Zulu, right? And saying likai in whatever, whether it's paid, whatever. Or saying goeie more in Afrikaans, or saying jurise in Shona. It's exactly the same way. You're just greeting. It's just different syntax, but the semantic, it means meaning. The underlying meaning are in all these statements that I've said. It's exactly the same thing. It's like I'm basically asking you or greeting you, right? So that's pretty much what I mean. It means exactly the same thing. The only difference is how you write it in Visual Basic. So student, and then we need num marks, right? Num marks. Remember, num-max, it has to be an integer. Okay, num-max is also a read-only property method. The only one that's an exception here, right? It's the array. Remember, we do not set the array underscore num-max. We do not set the array. We do not set the array here, right? We do not. What do I mean? We do not set the array. We don't pass a whole array here. So this array, I'll actually make it both. So you should be able to read the array and be able to set the array. So basically you should be able to get the array and set the array. So I need a get and a set statement. So if it's like this, we call this a get statement. So that's what I mean when I say get and set statements. So that means this property should be a property with both. So public marks, and remember this is an array as integer, right? And then end property. And then you just type in get, and then you should put in the set statement too. But remember, this is an array, so it needs to take in an index as integer. For those doing C++, again, this is the same thing as saying uj pixel get pixel. But remember, our pixel was 2D, so we have to pass in a row and a column, right? And then we put that const at the end. But in my case, I do not want to put the const at the end because I want it to be both. I want to be able to set it too. So it's like that in C++. So here I'm going to say return underscore marks, and then you pass in the index. But the index might be out of range, right? This index might be out of range. Should normalize validating, but there's no marks for that yet. I'm not sure, but we'll see. And then value, you see this value over here, it also needs to be validated because the user might give us an invalid value. We could also add like proper validation, right? To also check if it goes beyond the maximum of an integer. But that one, that's like an advanced class. It's for seniors, that topic. We're not gonna go into it too much. So we just not touch it at all. So yeah, remember what I was talking about the num marks. It's a percentage that between 0 and 100. So we need to, any invalid one should be set. When they tell you that, they mean create a helper method. So a helper method. So remember, helper methods, they're either private or protected. If you have inheritance, you have to make them protected. But if you have no inheritance, leave them as private. So private function and valid, I'm going to call it validate marks. Because, I mean, we are validating marks. And then they take in some value as an integer. and they return an integer. This function returns an integer. So I'm going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, okay, this is the function, right? They said you should validate and check that it's between 0 and 100. So I need to check if it's not below 0 and not above 100. So in C++, this function that I'm creating here is similar to the enforce range function. So like I said, it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is syntax. So if it's below 0, then what should happen? They said if it's, okay, for both cases, for both cases, if you check, they said any invalid entries should be set to 0. They said any invalid. So it doesn't matter whether you are less than 0 or above 100. As long as it's invalid, set it to 0. So that means that as long as it's invalid, that means I need to use the or. So I need to say or, because remember logic, for those guys who don't take math seriously, that's why coding is very difficult, because you can't apply your mathematical understanding since you neglected maths or you neglect maths. This is Boolean logic, right? This is logic, the one that you did last semester. So yeah, I'm doing logic here. Remember, or it can only be true when one of the statements are true. So remember, this value, it cannot contain both a negative and it cannot contain a negative number which is below 0 and the number 100 greater than 100 at the same time simultaneous. That's impossible, because it's a value, it's an integer. I can only store one value at a time. Hence, I'm using or, because only one of these cases can be true at a time. So value is greater than 100, then I should return 0. If nothing goes wrong, right, I'm going to teach you the other technique. So remember, this function is going to say you didn't return all code paths. That means it's telling you that what if this was false, it was entirely false. That means your function doesn't actually return. That's what it means by that green warning. So what I need to do is I need to return something at the end of the day. So if nothing was wrong, then I just return back my value, because nothing was wrong. That's pretty much the function that you need to make. So since I've made the function, now I need to validate my value. Remember this value that I was talking about here. So I'm going to cut that value and call my validate marks function. I pass in the value to validate it, to make sure that it's valid, because there's marks for that. And they explicitly told me to handle that. You see, they told me that any invalid should be set to 0. So they told me. So now I'm done. So we created the constructor with everything, and they told you in order. Be very careful, follow instructions. In order means that in this order. Start by passing full name, followed by student number, followed by num marks. You pass it in another order, you lose marks for that. So yeah, to do any necessary initialization, and also set the size of num mark of underscore marks array. Remember, we had an array. We had to resize it. And then settings during instantiation, blah, blah, blah. You may assume that num marks will be correctly provided. Do you know why they always give you this weird extra information, like this weird extra information? They're telling you do not validate it. Assume that it will be correct. That's what they mean. And then calculate. So we are done with our helper method and our constructor and our property methods. We're done with all of those, right? But then now we need our calculate average function. It calculates and stores the average of underscore marks array in the average and in the average in the variable underscore average. Once the average is calculated, it invokes the evaluate method. So that means the evaluate student method, it shouldn't be public, because as you can see, it's being called here. Unless they told you down there that you should call it, but I don't see where they told you down there. So that means the only function that should be public is calculate average. This evaluate student they're actually testing your critical thinking skills. They want you to see if you can think. They don't have to explicitly tell you, okay, make it private. you must use a brain. So public function, and then it's called calculate average. And I know it's calculating an average, so I'm gonna say as double, right? It's gonna return a double, but it might not, we'll see. It might not actually have, it might, okay, calculates and stores the average. Once the average is calculated, it invokes. They didn't talk about returning. That was my concern here. Do you see where they talked about you should return this? They didn't. So let's look at what this, if let's to in order to conclude what calc average should return, let's look at evaluate student. What should that method do? A method depends on the rules that differ depending on whether the student is a high school or university student. You see that it depends. That's when we have things like must override. So it's fine. I'll make it must override, but I won't make it public. It's fine. But I'll make it protected. So remember what I talked about, if you have inheritance, so you see that I inherited. So I now know that I have inheritance, and I now know that there's a function that can be implemented multiple ways, meaning that it depends on the child classes. Therefore, I'm going to make it must override. So let's look at what the other classes have. So where's the evaluates? So it sets, blah, blah, blah. And then if set, you see, we are setting things here. We are not returning. So it has to be a subroutine. So there's no returning here, it's just setting. But then it's up to you whether you're making it public or protected. But I don't see where you should make it protected. What is public? I don't see where you should make it public. So let's look at the display methods for this. Okay, they didn't talk about it. This was a bit vague, but it's fine. So let's create our calculate average function. Remember, they didn't talk about returning. So therefore, I'm going to change it to from function to subroutine. So they didn't talk about returning. If they don't mention the return keyword, make it a subroutine to show your understanding. So it calculates and stores the average of the underscore max array in the variable underscore average. So that means I'm using the underscore average, but before I use it, I need to set it to 0, right? To make sure that it's empty. Or I can do this. Why am I setting things here? Let me set them in my, so underscore average, let me initialize it also here. So underscore average is equals to 0, 0.0, since it's a double, but you can just set it to 0, it's still fine. I just like to set it to 0, 0.0 as a reminder that it's a double. So now I can calculate the average, but before I calculate the average, I need to calculate the sum. So I need to create a local variable, so dim sum, or let me leave it as sum, as integer. I mean, I'm adding up integers. There's no way I can miraculously have doubles when I'm adding integers. So hence the variable is going to be of type integer. For I as integer, so for I as integer 1, 2, underscore num max, right? Underscore num max, because that's the size of our array. And then now I call my array underscore max, and then I pass I, and then not this way. Remember, I need to sum it up. So sum plus equals, and then if I calculate the sum, I sum up all the values. Then once I'm done summing up all the values, I need to calculate the average. But remember, they said you should store it inside underscore average. So underscore average is equals to that sum divided by the number of things that I was adding, which is underscore num max. So now I have my average. But then there is something that I'm missing. Remember, they said it calculates and stores the average of the max underscore max array in the variable underscore average. We did that. We stored it in that variable, right? Once the average is calculated, that means once we are done calculating the average, what should we do? It invokes the evaluate student method. So we need to call that method. So remember, this method it needs to be created first, but they didn't talk about returning. And I looked at the child classes when they implement this function. The child classes also don't talk about returning. So that means it's a subroutine. They are testing you in terms of your critical thinking skills. And then they didn't mention anything about making it public or it should be accessed in. And the fact that it's being called here within calc average, that means it shouldn't be public. So they want to test if you're going to make it protected. So I'm going to make it protected and say sub evaluate student, right? But then remember this, there's nothing here that it's going to be different depending on the child class. And remember, since we have inheritance, I have to make this protected. So since it's going to be defined differently in the different instances of this class or different child classes, that means I have to make it a must override. That means the user, the child classes must override this function. But since I must override it, that means my class is incomplete. It's missing code because I didn't implement this function, right? So I have to tell Visual Basic that my class is incomplete by putting the must inherit keyword to say that it is a must for child classes to inherit from this class. It's a must. Hence, it's in the word itself, must inherit. Then I'm going to scroll down and I need to call the evaluate student function because it told you to call it there. So let me call it evaluate student, right? And then done. So technically, yeah, technically this will be polymorphism because remember it's going to be different based on that instance. So technically it's polymorphism, right? So I'm going to create the child classes now. Okay, I'm not done. Yeah, so I'm not done. We have the display method, right? Okay, so it's 38 minutes. There's still quite a lot of time for us. So we need to create a display method. And remember what I talked about. The display method, most of the time you have to make it overrideable because if you check the other classes, right, they should have also display methods. They didn't tell you here. I think this paper was very, very tricky. You see here, they didn't mention about, yeah, they didn't mention about any, yeah, they didn't mention about you redefining the display method, which is a problem. Yeah, they didn't mention about it. They didn't talk about it, but since they didn't talk about it, I'm assuming the only important information is the important information inside of my base class. Meaning only this time, right? I'm gonna leave it as a normal function. I won't say overrideable because inside of the other classes I shouldn't implement it. You see, there's nowhere where they told me, okay, declare display method. They didn't tell me. So they only told me to create a display method inside of my base class, which returns. You see, they told you it returns, meaning it's a function. So it returns a string description, right? Containing what? The student's full name and average. They said in what? In brackets. So I'll show you how to do that. So public function, because they told you it returns a string. So as string, so it should return, since this is it's not a lot of things to return, so return in brackets, right? So in brackets, I'll just put a curly brace like this. Okay, and then a space after it. And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do this and say full name semicolon colon, I mean like this, and then I display that as the full name. And then plus a comma, and then a space, and then I specify this is the average, right? And then a space. And you can use an ampersand or a plus, whatever you feel comfortable with. So I'll just change it to an ampersand or an and symbol. So average, right? Ampersand, the actual average. But remember, we usually have to round off, right? So I'm going to use the format They didn't tell you, but most of the time you're gonna get a weird number, so you have to round it off. So sometimes they're testing if you can think on your own without being instructed what to do. So there's the actual average, and then the last but not least, it's the closing curly brace. And then, okay, that's not the last thing. We also need an environment on new line. So ampersand environment dot new line, and then that's perfect. So that's everything. So we have our full name, and then we have this, and then the average. Yeah. So that's the only, those are the only details you're supposed to display. That's why they told you. Nothing more, nothing less. Just follow instructions. And then I'm going to create a new class. We have a university student and a high school student. So the class should be called high school. You see, they told you the class should be called high school. So I'm going to create here and then remove class one and put high school, then add. And then I'm going to need to put my option statements. Since I'm very lazy, I'm going to copy them, paste. And then I'm going to have my instance variables. So those will be my instance variables. So let's see what are my instance variables. So extramural, then we have prefect, and both are Boolean. So remember, variables need to be declared with underscore. So underscore extramural as Boolean, and then private. I think it's allowed to, can you do this? Yeah, I think it's allowed. Just like it's allowed in C++ to declare multiple variables of the same type in one line. So I'm going to say comma prefect because both are Booleans. There's no need for me to declare them separately. That's a new technique if you didn't know. Okay, let's see. I, yeah, so I have extramural prefect, we created that. Evaluate student, so we need to override. But before we do that, remember, create the following classes that are inherited from student. So we inherit from student. So I need to say inherits from student class, right? But remember, inherits, we had that must override, and it's a must for you to override it. Plus, we don't have the constructor, so we need to add the constructor. It's simple. You see how simple it is? You can autocomplete. I can just say this, and then I just click generate constructor. So double click, and then it generates a constructor for me. And then, but I want it to be on one line so that you guys can see. So I'm gonna say like this. Yeah, so this is the constructor. It created it for me. How convenient. And then for C++ users, this is constructor chaining. And then yeah, so we have our extramural variables, whatever, but um let me see. All students will have 3 marks. Hmm. And these people, they are testing you. You see here, how you're being tested. I don't wanna lie. This is like being tested on a different level. So they said you will have 3 marks. What does that mean? Remember our num marks, the number of marks, it should actually be 3. So we don't need to actually take in the num marks, but it's fine. But let's see what they say. Constructor with relevant parameters, meaning your extramural and prefect, right? You need to use those, but they didn't. You see, they said with relevant parameters, right? But they didn't mention about this. And if you think about it, Okay, yeah, it's okay, it's fine. Let's add them. Let's take them as parameters. But they didn't mention this thing. This paper was just open-ended. You had to figure out a lot of things here. So methods, and then so the next thing that I'm taking in is, remember, it's always in that order. Extra mural as Boolean, and then underscore prefect. I forgot to put an underscore for that prefect variable as Boolean, and then I need to put an underscore there. So remember, the first thing in your constructor, you always call your base classes constructor. Then you can initialize all the extra things. So remember, I need to use a me keyword here. So me dot extra mural is equals to underscore extra mural. And then me dot underscore prefect is equals to underscore prefect. And then done, we've created the necessary constructor, right? And then what do I need to do? So we need to use our evaluate student. We need to implement it, right? Remember, it was override. It was a must override. So we did override it, right? You can make it public. I think public, it wouldn't be a problem, but I don't see the need for that. But yeah, it's up to you. So evaluate student sets underscore qualifies to false by default, right? And true if this. So by default, it means that underscore qualifier should be false by default. What does that mean? So that means that, remember, the underscore qualifies is inside of my base class. So I have to use the my base keyword. So my base dot underscore. Oh, I forgot to make a few changes. Remember, we have inheritance. All of them need to be protected. Yeah, do not forget that there's marks for that. Everything that I'm writing right now, it's exactly how he expected you to implement it or to approach it. So my base dot underscore qualifies. They said by default it should be set to false, right? So I'm going to leave it as false by default. But if I have to, okay, you see that it shows that it's unnecessary, right? But it's fine. I want to remind myself that this is part of my base class. So it should be set to false by default, but it should be set to true if what? Remember, if, meaning it's an if statement. So if average is this, right? That means I have to do an if statement if underscore my base dot underscore average, right, is, they said if is less than what? Or greater than or equals to 0, greater than or equals to 80, I mean. So if it's greater than or equals to 80, right? But remember that there's this or. You see this or here. It means or also check this. So I need to put an or, and the next thing that I check needs to be within brackets like this. So I can put this inside its own set of brackets. And then I put an or there because I need to check these two conditions. So that or, and it can, another sort of a hint, right? You see that it has its own bullet to show that it's a different check, something that you need to check differently. So or average is greater than or equals to, so my base dot underscore average is greater than or equals to 70, and what, either extramural or prefect is true. Either, you see, another bullet point to show that this end means that this is another check. So I need to put in a set of brackets again to separate or to denote that, okay, this is on its own. And what, extra mural is equals to true, or underscore prefect is equals to true, because they said one of them. So you need to be very careful with this check here. This was a very it's not that straightforward, but straightforward if you know how to follow instructions. So that's the if statement that they wanted. Pay attention to where the brackets are. Very important. So when you look at this code, you should check where the brackets are. But we're still checking. We haven't done what we're supposed to do. They said it sets underscore qualifies to true if any of this was true, right? So that means here I should say my base dot underscore qualifies is equals to true. Or you see this false that I put at the top here. You can do this instead. They said you should only set underscore qualifies if this is true, right? But then there's an else too, right? In a situation when it's false, therefore should be set to false when this is not the case. So this is another way to do it, or you can just declare it outside there. That's up to you. So yeah, that's everything you have to solve here. You're done solving that question. You get your full marks. So they said with relevant parameters, right? So you need to put the relevant parameters, but let's keep track of this part. You see this one, the marks. That means when you instantiate a high school, you're going to pass 3 as the number of marks. When you instantiate a university, you're going to pass 2 as the number of marks. That's what it means. That's why they gave you that information there. So they didn't talk about property methods, nothing. Do not answer your own questions. You see here, they didn't talk about any property methods. No way. So do not create that. You see, they even told you no additional properties. So there's no anything else to add. No function for display, nothing else. Don't answer your own questions. Please don't do that. You're gonna waste time. So copy, and then I'm done with it. This class is basically done. This is all you need. Basically done. That's it. And then I'm gonna go to Solution Explorer and then create a new class. And I'm gonna call it University. And then add. And then my option statement, since I'm lazy, I'm gonna copy them and then add them here. And then I'm gonna need my instance variables. So my instance variables, okay, so I need to inherit, right? So before I do that, I need to inherit. So it inherits from student class. But remember, student has methods that you need to override. So there's that, we need that constructor. And then, yeah, we need that function that we need to override. And then good, and then I'm gonna put it here. And then remember, I want you guys to be able to see, so I'm gonna put it like this. Yeah. So after calling my base, remember we need, oh, they said this one has no extra variables, none. If you check, there's no additional properties, there's nothing else. So we just implement, and they said the constructor with relevant parameters, there's no extra parameter. So this that's pretty much it. Done. We are done with our constructor. We just have to implement this and then we're done with the class. So you see, if you don't answer your questions, you'll be spending time answering your own questions. So do not do that. So if average, right, is greater than or equals to 65, so I need to do a check. But remember, average is part of my base class, so I need to use my base keyword. So my base, it's not really a must to use my base, right? It already knows, but for your sake, to remember that this is part of base class is greater than or equals to 65, then what should happen? We set underscore qualifies to true, which is also part of my base. So my base dot underscore qualifies is equals to True. And then else, but I don't want else. I want else if. So else if, but else should also work, right? Because they said if it's less than 65. So if it's not greater than or equals to 65, basically 65 to infinity. If it's not 65 to infinity, then it's what? It's less than that, right? It can only be less than, so I have to use an else. So my base dot underscore qualifies is equals to false. And then done. That's all you have to do. Done with the classes. No, nothing else to do here. And keep track of something very important. They said, moreover, enumeration should be used where applicable, right? Should use an enumerator where applicable. So I'll see where I can use it. I can use it to define an enum for for what type of student, whatever, high school or university. I could use that. Yeah, I can use that. Okay, let me do that. Let me create that enum. That's the only place where I see it being applicable. So using a single array, they highlighted it in bold and also underlined for emphasis. And you see here why I say that property method should be bold. They told you that Mark's property method should, they give you a hint. Mark's property method should be used to enter the marks after the student object has been instantiated. So they know that students tend to forget the array. So that's why they gave you that hint there, just in case you forgot that there's an array within the class. So using a single array, instantiate objects to store information of the different high school or university students, right? So I'm going to go to my form and then I'm going to use my toolbox, go to here, drag and drop a button, and then enlarge the button. Then this button, I'm going to go to properties. So this button, its text will be initialize. Initialize what? Objects. I'm just gonna call it initialize object. I don't know what else to call it. So btn init or initialize, btn initialize, right? And then double click. But remember the option statements, I'm lazy. I'm just gonna copy and paste them there at the top. So there they are. And then remember they said single variable. And remember what we talked about, the form is also a class. So hence I say instance variables. So private, but the form is a special kind of a class. So we don't have to use underscores to create our variables. So I'm going to create a student. So I'm going to call it students in plural because there's multiple students. And the data type is student. And I'm going to have n students for the number of students as integer. And normalize putting comments, number of students. And remember what they talked about, you create an enum where applicable. So I'm going to define an enum here. So I'm going to say public enum, right? And then I'm going to call it, let me think. So for the different high school or university students. So as a type of student, right? So I'm going to say, I'm going to put an E there to emphasize that this is an enum. Why am I putting an E? Because I want to name it student, but there's already something else named student, which is the class. So hence I'm going to put that E and say E student like this, and then give my enum names. So I'm going to have high school, and I'm going to have what else? University. Yeah, in Visual Basic, you don't have to do this, right? There's no such thing as a comma, unlike in C++. You just write them in its own line. And an enum, it basically an enum, we're creating constants, right? Just like pi in maths, that's a constant. It doesn't change. So high school, so whenever you start the first variable in enum, it's always 0. And then the subsequent ones will be 1. So it increments by 1 every time you add a new instance. So this will be the values. So I can use these values to ask the user to choose whether it's a student or not. So they just want you to make use of an enum to just make your application beautiful, like easy to read, basically. But it's not really necessary. Enums are like used in rare cases, like rare. You don't have to necessarily use an enum, but they want you to use the enum. There's marks for it, so we want to use it. So instantiate objects to store information of the different high school and university students who apply for bursaries. The number of students, the type of students, and the values for each student will be provided by the user. So the first thing that the user should provide is the number of students. In that order, right? The number of student, then they choose what type of student they want to create, what type of student they are, right? So input box, enter the number of students, of students, or students, and then redeem my array, my students array to n students, since I now have the size of students or the number of students. But then there's multiple students, so now I go through all of my students. For I is integer is equals to 1 to n students. Then next I. And then the first question that I ask is, what type of student do you want to instantiate? And then based on the type of students that the user chooses, then I'll instantiate that student. So let's choose. Remember, you cannot instantiate the student object. Why? Because it's a must inherit class. It's incomplete. Remember what must inherit means. It just means it's incomplete. So must inherit just means incomplete, right? Basically, there's missing code. So therefore, you cannot instantiate it. Just to make sure you remember that you cannot, do not. I've seen students ask me questions and if you look at their code, they're getting an error that clearly states that you cannot instantiate an abstract class or a must inherit class in Visual Basic. In C++, it's called abstract class, but here it's called must inherit. So you cannot instantiate it. By instantiate, that means you cannot say new student. You cannot create a new student. Student is incomplete. Would you move into a REST that has no windows? Exactly. Or a REST with no Wi-Fi and no door. Would you do that? Or there's no door in the bathroom. That means when you shower and everyone can see you passing by. You get what I'm saying? You shouldn't create that object. It's incomplete. So what should we do? Ask the user to choose which student, right? Let's ask the user. So I'm going to say dim. I'm going to call it choice, right? As integer is equals to cint input box, right? And then enter. I'll call it choose, right? I'll just say choose the type of student, right? But before I do that, remember this value 0 and 1. So that means in my option that I should say option 0 represents a student. If the user enters an integer number 1, it represents a university. So you see how we'll use that right there. Then I'm going to use and. You can use environment.newline, right? But I'm going to also use a different keyword, VBCRLF, right? VB carriage return line feed. And then option 0 will be a high school student. Okay, I forgot the ampersand. Ampersand high school student. And then ampersand VPCRLF. Ampersand, the last one is option 1, which is a university student. Student. So university, student, and then done. So if the user chooses the integer number 0, we get back a high school. That means they're choosing a high school. If they choose, and then we move to a new line, and then if they choose the integer number 1, they're choosing a university student. So now based on the choice, right? So I will use a select case for this. You can use whatever you want to use. I will use a select case. So select case, choice, right? And then case 0. But remember, I shouldn't say case 0 because 0 is represented by a constant named high school. So I should say case here is equals to E dot, E student dot high school. So if if the case, remember this, all of this just returns a 0. You see that I didn't lie. If you check here, you see it's equals to 0. I didn't lie. So 0. Or you can, instead of, remember they said we should use the enum, right? So let's use the enum. So instead of, you might be like, well, what do you mean by we should use the enum? Well, by enum, that means we should create something of type E student. So let me create it. So dim choice as E student, right? Converts blah 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 from integer to form1 dot E student. Yeah, we can't do it this way, but you could do it that way, right? But it's fine, perfectly fine. I'm gonna say case it's a high school student, and then another case it's an E student dot university, right? And then if it's a university, then something happens, right? But remember what we talked about when we're dealing with doing all those past papers. There's common information in both classes, which is the one inside your base class. Full name, student number, marks. So they need to put them outside the select case or outside the if statement because those are common in all three. So dim full name as a string, and then cint input box. And then I'm going to say enter the full name for student, followed by that student. Um, and okay, and control to CSTR right? That student, not cint. Why am I saying cint? It's a string. And the question mark, right? And then I'm pretty much gonna repeat this 3 times. So not the same thing, but for the sake of saving time, right? Because I'm gonna be asking questions, but for the sake of saving time, so we have okay, only 2 times, because remember what I talked about. They told you the number of marks in each. So keep that in mind. So it's num marks, it's student number, I mean student number, and then enter the full name. Nope, enter the student number. But remember marks, we're told we know the actual integer for marks. How many marks? You see now I'm deleting more than I should be deleting. So, and question mark. So we have our select case. So depending on what type of high school it is or what type of student it is, we're going to instantiate that student. So student at I, right, is equals to new high school, right? This is high school. So new high school. And high school takes in how many, what things? Full name, comma, student number, comma. What else is taken here? Num marks. So num marks we were told in the slide in the PDF. So if you check high school, they said it should be 3 marks. So I should enter the number 3. So 3 is the number of marks. And then I have mural, extramural, and prefect. So I'll choose randomly. I'll just make extramural true and prefect false. They really don't care. You can choose any that you want. Is a class type cannot be used as an expression. Okay, this thing is tweaking. Let me just leave it. It's clearly tweaking. Our students, not... Okay, my bad. Yeah, it's students in plural. I was shocked that why is it not picking it up? So we do pretty much the same thing here with university. So new university. Yeah, this paper was really tricky. Yeah, really tricky in the sense that you need to think. So student number, and then here they told us it should be 2. And remember, for university, we only have the exact same parameters as the ones inside of our base class. So there's no new or there's no additional properties, remember, we were told. So yeah, we did get the number of students, we did get the type of student, and instantiated the right type of student, right? And then we also did get the values for each student from the user. But the last thing that we're missing is the array. So we are almost done. We need to get the array. And then this is what we call, I totally forgot to comment some things I'm getting to commenting, upcasting. Remember, this is where you get your marks for upcasting. And then I'm gonna go, so for j as integer is equals to 1 to students at index I. Remember, we have a property method for num marks. But it's read only. Like I said, it has to be read only. So dot num marks next j. And then now we can get the marks from the user. So, okay, I need to say students I write dot marks at index j is equals to, remember marks are integers. So cint input box, enter the marks for mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, and so forth. So ampersand CSTRJ, ampersand for student, we need to specify which student that is, so that just in case when the assistants are marking and they end up discussing and they forgot where they were currently at, they can remember that, oh, I was currently at this part. So I get the marks for the student, and then yeah, so this is pretty much everything. We get the marks. That was the last thing that was missing, right? We had to get the marks, and we did use enumerations, right? We used an enum. So now the next thing that we need to do is calculate the averages for each student and display the details of all the students in a multi-line text box. So why are they talking about, there's quite a lot involved. What type of a GUI is this? Because when I scroll down, right, remember what they said? They said using a UJ grid. So I don't know what type of a GUI you're going to have, but since I know I'm going to need a UJ grid at some point, I'm going to do this. This is going to be a very big GUI. So I'm going to stretch it out like that. And then I'm going to put this over there. And then I get my toolbox and I get a text box. So text box. and then drag and drop it here because we need to use it to display the averages, right? So multi-line, right? And then go here and then stretch again. There we go. And then remember we need to the scroll bars because we might have multiple information. So I need to go to properties for this text box and then click on properties. So the name of the text box is txt. I'm going to call it this time txt display. For those who are trying to cram, I'm going to also call it txt output. Students will surprise you, Shem. They even copy the names you are using for your text boxes. Students, I have seen it all. Students are just spiritual. So I only need vertical. I don't need the horizontal one. So I'm gonna set the scroll bars to be vertical. And then that's pretty much what I have to do. And then I'm gonna need another button to calculate the average and display, right? So properties, the text should be calculate average and display. So it does both things. It calculates the average and it displays it. So I'm gonna call it btn calc av or calc average. So calculate average and display, it does two things. So let's calculate the UJ grade part. This part over here, we'll get to it. Display the students that received the funding. Yeah, we'll get to that. Like I said, this paper was a bit tricky. No wonder why the classes were small, because they knew that they're gonna catch you when it comes to file handling. That's where they're gonna really get you. So this calculate the averages for each student. For each student, it means that I need a loop that goes through each student. For loop for each student. That's what they mean there. So for I as integer is equals to 1 to n students, next I, and then we calculate the average, right? So to calculate the average, remember to calculate the average, where's the function? Yeah, the average is inside your, what is this? Yeah, it's inside your base class data is here. But it makes use of this evaluate student, which is going to be defined differently. So this is what I will call this is where the polymorphism would be, because this function will be different based on the instance that's created. It will be implemented differently because it's also a must override. That means it will be overridden by the child classes. So we have this. Now I need to calculate my average. So students array at index I dot calc average, right? Remember it's a subroutine. So calculate the average. And then after calculating the average, immediately after calculating the average, I display the marks. I display the information for the user. Why am I displaying it immediately here after calculating the average? Because if you look at the display method, you're supposed to display the average. You cannot display it without calculating it. So hence they told you to do it in that order. So it's txt display dot append text, right? It takes in some text to append, which is the students array at index I dot display. And then I'll just for safety measures, just to make it a bit more beautiful, I'm gonna add a new line, right? VBCRLF. So I'm gonna do that. And then we are done with that. So yeah, let me see how many marks you have so far. Okay, yeah, you can calculate for yourself. The form class we are done. Comment where where polymorphism takes place. Okay, they want you to comment where polymorphism. You see, commenting is very important. So the polymorphism takes place with this display function too. So the polymorphism takes places in two places. So this is where we have polymorphism. So your comments will actually get you marks because they know where you've placed that polymorphism, where you've placed upcasting, downcasting, all those things. So here they didn't show marks for upcasting or downcasting, but you should always put it because question papers are always different. So let's see. So I'm gonna go up here and see where we currently are. So we finished with the function, with the displaying, right? And they say clearly indicate the single line of code where the polymorphism occurs. You may need to revisit other classes to answer this question. And they kind of told you, you see what they gave you a hint here. You may need to revisit other classes to answer this question. Remember the polymorphism that I was talking about, it's here. This was a very tricky place question. It's here. It's actually here. In display, I was just saying display, but to be honest, display is common. So this is not actually the polymorphism. Display is common. You don't override. Remember, student, this display function, it's not overridable. It's not must override. So it's always the same. So the actual polymorphism is here. It's good that I picked it up way before I even saw that question. But yeah, you'd have to read every single line here and see what's missing. And in order to get the full marks, because look at this comment. It's worth three whole marks just for that comment. So you can't lose marks because you didn't comment. Don't do that to yourself. And then now we get to file handling. So create a function called hash. Instructions are very clear. You need to follow the instructions. Should be called hash. Don't call it primary key function. Don't do spiritual things. You might even lose all the marks for that function just simply because you couldn't follow instructions. So hash function, and it's a function. It will always be a function. Always. So hash, it obviously takes in a key as an integer and it returns an integer. So as integer, and then it returns key modded by, we try to find the remainder by modding or by dividing that key by a specific prime number, I mean. So we need to find that prime number. So I'm going to put question marks here because I don't know what the prime number is yet. So it returns the prime number, where the prime number is the largest prime number that is less than the number of records. So we need to find out how many records are required. They said 13. So 12 is not a prime, but 11 is a prime. So the answer here, my prime number is 11. This was very easy because it's a small number. So my primary number is 11 because 11 can be divided only by 11 and 1. So it can be divided by 1 and itself. That's what we call a primary number. So we have that. And then next thing we need to create is a record structure called, they told you what it should be called, student rec. So let me go back up and then create so this paper was on steroids. Student record structure. So I think I see what Mr. Fa was saying here. I guess your paper is going to be similar to this. You might have an enum, you might have yeah, you might even have an enum too. So make sure you understand the code. And remember that with the enum where I've used it, right? You always just use the name of the enum dot to access that specific constant you're trying to access. And then you get that number. This is actually just me saying case 0. But if I just say 0 in the future, I won't know what 0 actually means. But if I just say e-student.high school, I know, oh, this is a high school student. This is a university student. Even though the integer is just integers 0, 0 and 1. And then They said for Poppy reason, it's Poppy Act. You can Google it and see what that means. We are only interested in storing a student number, average, and the amount of funding. So the receives in rands. So they receive that funding in rands, right? So the funding, I'll make it a double. They didn't tell you about the types here. Keep that in mind. They didn't tell you about the types, but we know for a fact what do we know for a fact? A student number needs to actually be an integer. Why? Because it's going to be used as a key here. You see here, it's going to be used as a key. We need to hash it, remember. So I have to make it a okay, I'm doing it wrong. This is private. Yeah, even the enum is private. It's not public. Private. And then public student number as integer, right? And then what's the next thing? The average, which we know is going to be a double. Average is double. And then the last one is what? The amount of funding, right? So I'm gonna say funding, which I know the amount can be an integer most of the time, but most of the time it has to be a double because your fees are not always like an integer, right? So they can be 300 and what is 35,450 rand, something like that. Point is 0.30 cents or whatever. So it can be a double. Most of the time it's going to be a double. So this I'll just put a comment there and say amount of funding. Remember, comments have marks. If you don't put comments, you're cooked. In rands, right? You can also put that comments to signify that it's in rands. Or you could do this, right? I can say funding in rands. I know it's a bit long, but it just helps in the future when people read my code. Oh, they see funding in rands. So it was using South African rands, which makes it easier for the next person reading my code. So create a random access file called students dot dot to store 13 student records. So this should store 13 students, right? So I'm gonna copy this, right? And you don't remember, I know students are focused on output, right? They don't care about your output. They're gonna mark code. Just write the code. I know you'd be like, well, where will I get this record structures, whatever, with this 13 students, things like it doesn't really matter. This is a different section. It's just they just want to see whether you understand file handling. That's all. Write the code that they need, and then you'll be sorted. So I need to do this copy, paste. I need to save it to a file. So I need to write this and say save to random access file. So that I remember that this saves to a random access file. btn save to file. Because in the future, when I look at my GUI and especially if I look at my GUI and things like that, I won't necessarily know that this is what is this? If random access or it's a binary file, or it's a text file, I won't know. So I need to make it easy for my future self and other programmers. So is file stream, and then remember we're dealing with random access, so I'm gonna need a binary writer, which I'm gonna call BW as binary writer. And then I'm gonna need a binary reader, BR as binary reader. And then I'm done. Then in my button to save to the file, right? Because remember I need to save, and they told you how many records? 13 records, student records. So it's 13 student records, right? They gave you that number. So let's see what the question is. Do they want you to like save to as one specific student or to save all 13 students? We need to check and understand. So let's see. Ensure use a prime number division hash algorithm. So use that function. That's what they mean there. You may assume that the file is saved in the local folder, meaning in the debug folder. You will need to populate this file with blank student records. So you see, they put you on purpose that it should be blank. So this file, they really don't care about the file. All they see is they want to see the code. Even if you write to the file and there's blank information in the records, that's fine. They just want to see that you know how to do file handling. They even told you in this question paper that it should be blank. Explicitly told you that it should be blank. So they said this should store 13 students. So I need to create a variable of type record structure, of type student rec, and it's an array with 18 students, right? So I'm going to say private, what am I going to call it now? I'm going to call it, I don't even know what to call it now. So I'm going to call it, and it has to be have a reasonable name. So I'm going to call it student recs, right? Or student records. Okay, let me call it student records. If I say recs, I don't know what that means. It could mean anything. Recs as in money. So you see, it gets confusing. So just write in full student records as student record, student rec, right? So they said 18 records. So this hence I created that array. And they said it should be blank. Like I said, do not waste time trying to save the actual information. They even told you that it should be blank. So for I as integer is equals to 1 to student records, right? There's this feature that I hope you guys know it, but there's this feature whereby instead of me passing the actual number 13 there, I can pass in the name of the array, and then I say dot length to get the length of the array. But this length property method, right? This problem is that it always return the actual length plus one, which is wrong. So we have to always subtract a one there. So I'm gonna use that technique just to give you a lot of tools in your toolbox so that when you go and write, there's multiple ways you can approach the problem so that you can also feel like you're a genius. Yeah. So I'm gonna copy that. We need to save all of these students, right? So before I save all of these students, outside I need to instantiate my file stream first. So new file stream, right? It takes in three things: a location, which is a string, and then a mode, which is in the file mode, and then a file access. So the location, remember what they said, it's local. So dot backslash, this is the name, students dot comma file mode dot open. In this case, remember we always use create and whatever, but in this case, like I said, they always assume that you're gonna create the file yourself. And then file access dot write, right? No pun intended. So before I continue, let me actually create the file before I forget. Because if you try to open and the file is non-existent, it's gonna crash. That's Visual Basic. It's gonna do that, it's gonna crash. So I'm gonna open here and then remember it's in the bin folder and then debug. That's what it means to be saved locally in your local folder. So this will be obj.dat. Oh, okay, I can just remember I copied the name. So students.dat. Yes. So there's the file. And then the file is now in existence, which is fine. And we need a binary writer because we are writing to the file. So new binary writer, which accepts a stream object, which is the file stream. So we pass that file stream. But remember, you must always close the connection to your file. Always close the connection. Connection, you must always close it. So we've saved, we've instantiated our tools, right? We are ready to write to the file. But remember, we're still writing to a binary file. So before we forget, we need to make sure that it is serializable. So I'm going to make sure I start, you see, to avoid a lot of errors, right? I'm gonna say it's serializable starting from my base class, serializable. Because if my parent is not serializable, that means me as their child, I'm also not serializable because I inherit, remember. So I have to make all three serializable. Serializable, it means that the objects can be written to a binary file. We need to give tell Visual Basic that I'm giving the class the permission to be written to a binary file. Because random access files are still binary files, right? Hence, we're using a binary writer, writing to binary. Terminology is very important. Try to read in between the lines. So there's our file, right? Let's write to the file. So remember, when you're writing, we need to say br dot serial. Is it? I think it's serialized, right? No, I need to seek first, right? So seek, and then after seeking, I could, right? Remember, I could say student records, right? At index I, comma, and then seek origin dot begin. Start at the beginning of the file, but cannot be converted. Oh, my bad. Dot student number. So I use the student number as um the indexing number, right? But remember, if you use the student number as a way to index into the file, there might be collisions. So hence we need to hash to avoid collisions. And then when you hash, it's going to be, what is this? It's going to be, what's this thing? It's going to produce indexes like in a loop, like position one, position two, position three. That means we'll never have collisions. And then binary writer dot seek, and then yeah, is that pretty much it? Let me check something here. Yeah, and then yeah, and then oh, okay, yeah. After seeking, then you write the files. So let's the information in the file. So let's write the information in the file. So I start by writing it in that same order, right? So I use the write method. I start in that same order I've declared it in the in the record structure. So student number followed by average, followed by funding. So b binary writer dot write, and then this should be average, and then binary writer dot write, and then this should be funding dot funding in rands. And then done, 100% done with saving to the file. But we can also, last but not least, we can also set fs to nothing, right? To mean that it points to nothing. In C++, this is the same as setting it to null pointer. That's what nothing means for those doing C++. But nothing just means we're sending it to nothing because we set it to a file stream object, right? Meaning to a reference. It's allocated for advanced people. In an advanced class would say that it's allocated on the heap. But for now, you don't have to know about that. But just always set it to nothing, to always point to nothing. So okay, for the sake of understand what I mean by nothing, right? I'm going to use draw.io. So draw.io, just and to make you understand what the new keyword means when you say new. So I'm gonna create, and then I'll save it anywhere. So when you say new, right, it's like this is what's happening, right? In coding or in programming, you always have two things. We have a stack and a heap. So the stack is like, okay, the stack is like your grandmother's place, right? You go visit your grandmother there. So this is the stack. So when you visit your grandmother, obviously you know how grandparents are. They're so chilled. They won't make you clean and do all those things. So that's why I use that as the example, because on the stack everything is managed for you. The allocating, using the new keyword is done for you on the stack. But if you do it yourself here on the heap, you need to free the memory or delete properly. So you can imagine that everything is stored inside of a box, right? We put in a box. Let's say when you say new file stream object, right? This is what happens. Just imagine this is actually what happens. It's not a matter of you just trying to picture it, but this is actually what happens. When you use that fs, you see that fs variable, like this here, that fs variable that I created, file stream variable. It saves it on the stack, and then it creates a new, when you use the new keyword, right? This new keyword, it's saved on the heap. Remember the heap, it's like your parents' place. You are forced to do everything on your own. If you want to eat, they tell you go wash the dishes. If you also want to eat, they tell you go cook. But with the stack, everything is done for you. Your granny will say, sit down, my child, relax. You've worked hard. You're also stressed with school and things like that. Relax, I'll cook for you. That's the stack. It's managed for you. So I'm gonna do this. When you say new, right, it creates a new file stream, right, on the heap memory when you use the new keyword. You can imagine that it created a new file stream on the heap, right? After I created that file stream object, okay, it created a box that can store a file stream, right? And then it returned the address to that box and stored it inside fs. So basically, fs is pointing to the file stream box. So when you say close, right, we're closing the file, or basically, in essence, when you say close, it's like technically like we are deleting like this, but then you see there's this path, right, or this road. What if I mistakenly travel, go through that road and try to go there and there's nothing there? So that's when my program just crashes for no reason. It doesn't tell me what the error is, but it crashes. So hence you need to set it to nothing. Nothing just means that literally it's pointing to nothing. So this arrow, it moves down here to point to nothing. So that when you try to go there, you'll be like, wait, there's nothing there. It's a subtle thing, it's a small thing to really think about, but it actually saves us a lot of trouble. So I'm gonna put back that box like this. So this is pretty much how what's going on behind the scenes. So that's why this part is very important, but you don't necessarily have to put it because it's Visual Basic. But I've advised you to always be thorough. And then once I'm done reading, I need to output a message box, right, to say that everything went well. So message box successfully saved to random access file. So I've successfully saved to random access file. So let's read the next question. Yeah, now I'm feeling parched. Create a function. So function is called write to file that accepts, it means that it takes in as a parameter that thing, a student object. They didn't say a student rec. Keep that in mind. They didn't say a student rec. They said a student object. So there's that student rec object. So I need to create that function. So private function. Oh, is it okay? Let's make it public. Public function write to file, which takes in a student object, right? So, and I don't know what it returns. So we need to check what it returns first before we can continue. And writes the applicable attributes to the random access file you created earlier. So remember we created a random access file, right? So what we're supposed to do here? to store the 18 records, student records, and then to fill it with blanks. Yeah, it's fine. So they just wanted you to fill it with blanks. That's fine. So it accepts a student object and writes the applicable attributes. See, the important part is what? Applicable attributes to the random access file you created earlier. Ensure you use prime number division to hash. So basically okay, so what they wanted here, right? You see, they say create a random access file, right? So my assumption, I think they want you to use the create keyword, right? So they don't want you to create manually. That's what I'm assuming here. So they want you to create it. So I need to change that from .open to .create. So .create. Right? So I'm gonna create a new file because that's you need to understand the questions properly. So I want you to create that. Even though I'm gonna fill it up with blanks, it's fine to save 19 records. It's fine, it's just blanks. But the only important thing that I need to change was from open to create. So if it's not there, it needs to create it. I'm creating it using code, not manually. Yeah. So let me see how much time. Yeah, I've spoken a lot. That's why my throat hurts now. So ensure you use a prime number division remainder algorithm, blah, blah. You may assume that the file is saved in the local folder. And then here, applicable attributes random, use the prime number to map the student number to a record position. So I need to, so it needs to be able to write one student, right? It needs to be able to write one student, but you see, they didn't talk about returning. So me, I always my rule of thumb is that if they don't mention return, make it a sub routine. So end sub. Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting. My bad. It's a bad habit that I have. But yeah, it's student. I'm thinking about the syntax in another language. It's student as student. So it needs to write the applicable attributes. So we need to write the applicable attributes to the file. Applicable attributes. So, okay, this is a bit tricky, right? But remember something that I will keep talking about, right? You see, when they say applicable, you see this Mr. File is very tricky. It's like a snake. When you least expect it, that's when it just attacks you. So applicable. That applicable is a very tricky situation. You don't know whether it means that to check what type of child class it is or what. But what I'm assuming is that he wants you to check what type, right? So let's do that. So remember our base class by default it has all the common things, right? Which is full name, student number, and then the marks. Not really num marks, but we don't have to write the number of marks, but we could, right? Remember, we could. So let me think about it. Yeah, we could write the number of marks and the average and whether the student qualifies or not. We could write all of those things. We could. Let me see. Did I create a qualifies property method? Yeah, I knew something was missing. I didn't create an average property method and the qualifies property method. Those two are missing, even though they should be read only, but they are missing. I was supposed to have them. So public read only property average is double and property, and then it will simply have a get statement because I'm only accessing return underscore average. right? And then the last one is the qualifies, right? So qualifies is Boolean and property, and then get, and then you return underscore qualifies, right? So the tricky part is they said applicable. It means that you need to know what type of instance it is because each instance also provides its own unique set of information. For example, high school has extramural and prefect, but it's only high school. So it's not really that deep. It's only high school that has unique details. So we should write the common things first, right? We write the common things first. So the way I'm gonna write it, right? I'm gonna write all of them. They say it does specify that it's applicable, but applicable in the way I view it as like depending on the child class. So I need to write the full name, student name, marks, num marks, I mean, marks, array, average, qualifies. That's common in all of the classes. So let's start by doing that. So for I, okay, not for I is integer, my bad. So I need to instantiate a file stream object, new file stream, right? Which takes in a location, they said local folder. So dot backslash students dot that, and then file mode. So file mode is different now because I'm opening a file that I've already created. So file access, now I want to add write again. Remember, this said you should write that information to the file. So this comment needs to be changed to successfully saved or successfully created random access file because the main goal, that's why they said put dummy data there or name any blank data, meaning put nothing into the file because the main purpose was just to create the file. Even though it's a redundant thing, but it doesn't seem necessary, but there's marks for it. We need to use it. So binary writer, because I'm writing to a binary file. So a new binary writer takes in a stream object, which is that file stream. At the end of the day, we need to close the connection and then set our fs to point to nothing. And then the important thing that we need to do is start by writing. So write common things to the file. And remember, common things, the base class and the university class, they basically have the same variables. So the only one that's unique is high school. So after writing all the common things, I need to check what instance is student. What data type? Is it a type of a high school? If it happens to be a type of high school, then I should also write those extra things. But before I do that, I need to downcast it, right? Remember, we upcasted there, so I need to downcast because the student, it's of type student. That means it only has things that are inside the student class, which are there's private, there's instance variables. But me, I want to access things that are inside high school. So you see, it becomes a problem. So I need to downcast or cast it down the inheritance hierarchy, basically converting it from the base class to a child class. And when you convert, that conversion is called downcasting because you're going down the inheritance hierarchy. And since I need to save that extra mural and prefect, I need to make it a read only. I need property methods for it. It didn't tell you, but yeah, this paper was just a mess. I didn't actually think informatics is that deep, but it's really that deep. It's like, yeah, you have to really know your stuff. So extramural, and both of them are booleans as boolean and property, because I think they always want to see upcasting and downcasting. So hence they always say the appropriate, something like that. It's sort of like giving you a hint that find a way to determine what type of instance it is. Extramural and then prefect prefect, and then good. We're good to go. So let's write the information. So remember, start by common information. So I'm going to say br dot write, but before I do that, I need to give the student number or the student a specific position in the file. So I'm going to use the seek method and then student dot student number, but I need to hash it and then seek origin dot begin, start from the beginning. But the student number, I need to hash it. Yeah, you remember what I was talking about, the string? Yeah, you see, remember student number, they said characters. So we had to make it a string. But when you're working with file handling, we need to cast it to an integer. So this is going to be quite a handful. So you need to pass it into the hash, but remember a hash function expects an integer. So we cast it to an integer. So that's quite a handful, but not really a handful. But it's like you need to really think before you start writing. So br.write the student's full name dot full name, and then bw.write. What else is students? What again? Student dot okay, is it this? Are these the common ones? After student, I want to put it in that exact order. So let me go back here. Student number. So dot student number. But remember, our file it needs the student number to be okay. It's fine, even if we write it as a string. But the important part is here when you hash, it has to be an integer. So that's fine. I'll leave it as it is. Bw.write. After student number, we take in the num marks, the number of marks. So student.num marks. So that's why they told you to create those property methods. There's always a reason for everything that they tell you to do. But now the marks array, it's an array. So I have to go through every single value. So I need to delete this and say for I as integer is equals to 1, 2, num marks, right? So it's going to be student.num marks, right? Because the marks is stored inside the student class, which is referenced with that object name. And then I'm going to say bw.write. And then what am I writing? Student dot marks. Okay, that's position I. And then once I've written all the values in the array, what should I do? I should also write the average and qualifies in that specific order. So bw.write student.average. And then last one is bw.write student.qualifies. And then that's pretty much all you have to do. So we're done with that function. And then create a function called read from file that accepts a student number. The function should return. You see, this time around, they told you that it should return. So it's an actual function. So read from file, it takes in a student number. So it takes in an integer, right? So public function read from file, which takes in a student number as an integer. And they said it returns the actual record. So as student rec, it returns the actual student. Is a student record? I wouldn't say student record, right? I would say, how do I put it? I would say the student object. They didn't phrase this properly. It has to be a student object. Why? Because the right function, it wrote objects. So we can only read the object back because we stored an object. So it should actually return a student, not a student rec. So I think that was the mistake there. But yeah, we should read from the file, should return. So basically, we should read from the file. And then what we've read from the file, we should store it inside. We should return a student rec. So that means I need to create a student record structure here. So I'm gonna say record, right? Yeah, me and being used to other languages. So dim student as record, right? And then at the end of the day, I'm gonna return that record. Not as record, what am I saying in my brain? As student, then the variable name is record. And then it's gonna complain that is set to nothing. But you can always, if an object is, you don't have anything yet, you just always start by setting it to nothing. So dim as student is equals to nothing. It starts off as nothing, right? Then we read from the file. So create a new file stream object, file stream, and then saved locally. Remember, our file is called students.dat, and then file mode dot open. I want to open the file, and then I want to read it. So file access to read. Since I'm reading, I'm going to use a binary reader. So new binary reader, which takes in a file stream. But then remember, we need to always close our file stream or cut the connection and also set it to nothing once we're done using it. Right. And then in the exact same order that we saved the file, the data in is the exact same order we should read it. So keep that in mind. So before I do anything, I need to seek. So I need to seek, meaning I need to find that function, that student record. So bw.seek that student with that student number. So this is now, yeah, this is now the student number. So I need to delete this. It already accepts it as an integer, so there's no casting needed here. So student number, but it's no longer bw, it's br because I'm reading. Oh, it's not, oh, there's no member function here. Yeah. When you're reading, you have to use the file stream fs to seek because br doesn't, the binary reader doesn't actually have a seek method. So you have to use the file stream to seek and find that record with that specific position. Hence, we hashed it. So now, since we've read, we've done, we've been seeking that record. I need to do this. Oh, I'm not done. What am I doing? I'm not done. Remember, I talked about that information that's unique depending on the type of student. Remember, this information here, right? It's common in both classes, but remember, high school instance has extra information, so I need to check. So I need to check if type of student object, right? Student variable is a high school instance. Then what should happen? So if this object, its type is a high school, then I can downcast. Why am I downcasting? Because if I say student dot, I don't have access to things that are inside high school because this student it's of type base class. So I need to cast it down to a high school. So before I cast it down to a high school, I checked if it actually is of type high school. And if it's true, then cast it down. So I'm going to say dim high. I'm going to call it high as high school. And then, like I said, I'm going to use a what is this? Try-cast, I mean, not try-catch. Try-cast, and then try-casting what exactly? Student object to a high school. So it can either return something or nothing. But then it shouldn't return nothing because I did check if it's a high school, so it'll always return something. So there's no need for me to check if high is nothing. I don't have to check because I know for a fact it always returns something. So since it returns something, I need to write. So I need to say bw dot write. What am I writing? Remember, it has extra mural and prefect. So high dot extra mural, and then bw dot write high dot prefect. And then we are done writing everything to the file. And then here we need to read, right? So I'm pasting it here because I want to read it in that specific order, right? So I'm reading it because I want to get it back in that specific order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, so what I'm going to do, right? Let me see. Okay, it's fine. Instantiate, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, it's fine. I kind of have an idea of what to do. So remember, I need to store these variables, right? So dim full name is a string, and then I read from the file. Remember to read, you say br, and then you call the read method, read string, read int, whatever you are reading. So read string, because I'm reading a string from this file stream. And then the next thing after the full name was the student number, which is also a string because we saved it as a string, is equals to br dot read string. And then the next thing that we need to store, oh, it's conflicting. We're accepting a student number that it's conflicting. So I'll call it student num to be so that it's unique. And then dim num marks, of which you know for a fact it's an integer, is equals to br dot read int 32, not 64. Because when you store an integer, it's going to be stored as an int of 32 bits, right? So I've already retrieved this string. So now I have num marks. I can go through all the marks for that specific object. So okay, you see that it's a bit similar to what you do. Yeah, but before I do that, right, I need to instantiate the student. Remember, it's still set to nothing. And I have all the three pieces of data that I need, which is there's three. So I'm going to say from 1 to num marks, and then I need to read the marks, right? And there's multiple marks. But before I do that, I need to instantiate that student. So it's called record. I've called it a record is equals to new. New what exactly? You see that it becomes very tricky. It's a new what? That's the question. It's a new what? It's a new student or what? So let's see. So and writes the appropriate attributes to the access file you created earlier. Ensure use a hash blah blah blah. So now the tricky part is how do we know what type of student, like what type of child class is it? Is it a university object or it's not? So it becomes very tricky to find out because now how will I know? Like I can never know because I just saved binary, I just saved information. I was writing the variables. That's it. How will I know? So me, the strategy that I'm gonna use here, they didn't tell you because that's the thing. How will you know? Because all you're just writing is information. You're not writing or you're not sure what type it is, right? So let me see if I can do this. Dot read can you read an object? No, you can't. Yeah, you can't read an object, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do, right? This is what I'm going to do. Yeah, this is what I'm going to do. Before I write it, the first thing that I'm going to write to the file, right? It's what type of object. So write to the file the type of object. Like I said, this is very difficult. You'll never know. I think that was this paper was on steroids. It was on fire. So if type of student is what they say, let's start by checking if it's a university. If it's a university instance, remember I'm just doing these checks just to write that first line in the file, which denotes what type of an object it is. So I'm just gonna say if it's a university, then I'm gonna say bw.write, and then I write a string and say university. That I know it's a university object. And then else if or it can just be else because there's only two types of students, but I'm just gonna use an else if student is high school, meaning that is a high school student, then bw dot write high school, and then done. This should solve my problem. The first thing that I write in the file is what type of an object it is. So since I now know what type of an object, that's the first thing I read from the file. So I'm gonna say dim, I had to say type of student. I have to save that as type of student as a string is equals to bw dot br dot read string, I mean. And then this string, right? The thing is, you will never know in what specific case, like in terms of uppercase or lowercase, whatever. You see how it is. Me, I'm going to do this. I'm going to use a function that you guys haven't been using a lot, but it's very useful. When I say dot to lower, I mean that it returns a copy of the string converted to lowercase, so that I know that this string will store only lower cases. Therefore, when I'm doing a check, I check in terms of lower cases. And then now there's multiple ways I need to check what type of object it is. So I need to check what type of an object it is. So I need to say if, um, but now I don't have to use type of because this is impossible to use type of here. So I have to check that string. Check the string and say dot equals, right? You can't remember strings are very different. So you need to use the equals method. So equals to what exactly? If it's equals to university, remember I converted it to lowercase. So the string that I type to compare should be typed in lowercase letters because I did convert to lowercase. So if the type of is a university, then that record, I set it to a university. So new university, which takes in a full name and a student number and marks, right? And then else if type of student variable dot equals a high school. Remember, it's in all small letters because I did convert it to a lowercase. That means the record should be instantiated to a new high school, right? But then remember, record high school is a bit complicated because I need the extramural, we need the prefect, as Boolean, whatever. So for now, right, for now, the extramural and whatever, I'll set them to false. Then I'll initialize them when I read from the file. You can do that, remember, that's allowed. So student num marks, and then I'll just set both of them to false because I haven't read them from the file yet. So I'm just gonna set them to false. And then whatever object I've instantiated to, I've instantiated it to the right one. Remember, marks is common in all of them, so I can just use a for loop. I do not have to check what type of an object or an instance it is to use marks. So record dot marks at index I, and then I need to say br dot read int 32, right? The same way I stored it. Remember, I stored it in what way? I created a for loop and then I wrote one by one. So the same way I wrote it, I need to read it with the for loop one by one. And remember, the order matters. The same way you wrote the file is the same way you read from the file, the exact same order. You mess up the order, you're going to have issues. And then I need to store the record, record dot what dot average, right, is equals to binary reader br dot read. It was a double, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the average is a double. So read double. Reads an 8-byte floating point from the stream. Oh, okay, average is read only. Yeah, this is very tricky. So average and qualifies, right? Okay, all the other ones, let me see. Did I set the num marks? Okay, yeah. So average and qualifies, they actually have to be both. Because you see now, because we have the file handling part. So I need to have a set value as a double, and then underscore average is equals to value. So it needs to be both. You need to be able to read and write. So value as Boolean, underscore qualifies is equals to value. And then, yeah, so this error should go away. Because now I have to read from the file. I didn't know, but I did when I read there wasn't any play part where it says okay you have to save. So I just assumed it has to be a read only. So there's the average. We've saved it, now we need to save the qualifies. So dot qualifies is equals to br dot read boolean, right? With the boolean type. And then we're almost done. Remember, all these ones, right, are common in the what is this? University. But high school also has its own two things. So we need to check what type of student it is and then extract that information. So yeah, remember here we checked what type of student it is, and then we wrote the extramural and prefect. So we need to also check what type of student it is, and we did it immediately after writing the average and qualifies. And here, immediately after reading the average and qualifies, we do the same thing. So remember, I created a variable to store the type of object. So if type of student, I think it's I call it type of student, dot equals to high school, because high school is the one that is unique or that is extra information. If it is a high school, then what should I do? Because I'm gonna have an issue if I say record dot. Yeah, I started having issues here. You see, I can't say record dot I can't say record dot and access the information inside of a high school. I would have to cast. So I have to downcast. So I have to say dim. I have to say dim. Okay, this is going to be very annoying, but yeah, let's do it. So dim high as high school is equals to try cast. Try casting what exactly? Record to a high school. Then when that's done, I can read the extra mural and the other one, right? So dot extra Miro is equals to, both of them are booleans, right? So dot read boolean. I think it doesn't have it's a read only, yeah. So yeah, my advice, right? Just make all your property methods to have both. You can read and write. Because the thing is though, some information they'll give you later. That's the problem. So that's the problem here. They didn't talk about setting any values here. But when you went to the file handling part, that's when you realize, oh, it needs to do both. So underscore extra miro is equals to that value. And then I need to also put a set statement here. So set value as boolean, and then underscore prefect is equals to value, right? And then now it can do both. So that error should go away. There we go. It's gone. So extramural dot I dot prefect is equals to br dot read boolean. And now once we've read the boolean, right? Remember here we're trying to downcast, right? And then here now we need to point. Okay, this is going to be very, very weird, right? So since I don't like doing it this way, right? I don't like doing it this way. I'm gonna go back to my if statements, right? These if statements are very important. I know I'm gonna repeat some code, but this if statement is actually very important because here I know for a fact I'm instantiating it to a high school. So I think Visual Basic should pick it up. When I say record and I say dot extra miro, okay, it doesn't. I thought it would pick it up. Dot extra miro, yeah, I thought it would pick it up, but I feel like that's the better approach. So let me do that. So let me do this. I know it's going to be a bit, there's going to be repetition, right? But I prefer to do it this way. So let me do it this way, and then let me do it the long way, the way they do it in the slides, right? So record, I'm not going to initialize this record. And when I say dim high is high school, right? I'm gonna leave it as that, and then instantiate, and then read all of that. And then I also need to read this extra two things, right? Just to make my work easier because now it was taking more time than needed. Then at the end of the day, I need to upcast. So record is equals to high upcasting, which is not really here. It's actually this specific line. Yeah, so this is another way to do it. So let me do it this way even here. So dim uni as university. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to upcast. So record is equals to uni upcasting. Yeah, so this is better this way, even though I'm repeating. You see why you see why I say I'm repeating? Because I get the array, I read the array here, and then I read that here. Actually, it doesn't really matter in this case because I don't have a lot of code. So I'm gonna write it this way. So yeah, this is how you would read from this file. So you would read the type of student first, then check what type of student the student is. If it's a university, create a university. But remember, they said it should return a student. So I need to upcast it. So I must upcast it at the end. So that when it gets returned here, it returns an actual student, something of student type. Yeah, so that's pretty much all you had to do there. So we have our functions, right? We created the functions. Every year, the Barrier Foundation puts aside 1 million, right? So they put 1 million as funding to be split equally amongst the university students qualifying for the bursary. So that means high school students, um, their budget is 500,000. University student, their budget is 500,000 since it's split equally. That is, if five students qualify for the bursary, each will get 200,000, right? Furthermore, the Utopian grants awards to top students with an additional 10,000 rands in bursary money. This is the student with the highest average. You may assume that only one student will have the highest average. So using the single dynamic array of student objects, save all students. Okay, save all. It wants you to save all of the students that will receive funding to random access files. So that means the students that will receive funding, it's basically students that qualify. How do we know they qualify? 1 million. The, these people have these people have jokes. Remember Zoom. Listen properly. Sorry, 1 million, 1,000 trillion. Listen properly. And then he shakes his head like this. So they're making reference to that. For those who didn't pick it up. So you may assume that only one student will have the highest average. So for the additional 10,000, right? Okay, so we need to save all the university students that will receive funding. Oh, they said university students. They said using that dynamic array, save all university students. So we should actually save only university students. They didn't talk about high school. So this money only goes to university students qualifying for the bursary. That is, if the student qualify for a bursary, the five students, they'll each get 200,000. How do we know if they qualify? Let's go and check the information that is stored for each university student. So evaluate students. You see, you remember this qualifies. So you're basically checking if the student qualifies. That means their average is greater than 65, which is exactly what they do at university. So you're actually implementing the code that they have in their system to check if you qualify for a bursary. Because I'm telling you, if you pass the really very well this year and you go next year to the finance and you say you want to apply for a bursary, they're gonna say, what's your average for last year? Is it 65 and above? Then they'll give you a bursary. It's literally a real life thing. So we need to check all the students that qualify, then save them to you see, we save them to the file. So we have a function called write to file. That we just finished, that we created, which is over here, write to file, which expects a student. So let's do that. So here, it's not really saved to random access file. It's not technically, it's not. Let me rename this to create, because we're only creating a random access file there. So create random access file so that it exists, so that we can save to it. And then here in the next line, that's when we actually save to the file. Okay, this is not what I want. I need to name it first. So let me, I need to rename it. So here, save students that qualify. Well, let me say save students. So let me say save university students to file, to random access file. So save them to a random access file, and then I'm gonna call it btn save. Yeah, so save university students to a random access file. So we need to go through all of the students to check which ones qualify. Yeah, this paper was no joke at all. Like, to be honest, this feels like a sub. Yeah, or a seek test. Yeah, it's like it's a seek test, this one. So yeah, let's save. So I need to check if the student qualifies, right? But yeah, so I need to do an if statement. So if students at index I dot qualifies is equals to true, that means they qualify for funding, right? And if they qualify, before I continue, remember what the question paper said. They said this is the students with the highest average. So we need to allocate an extra 10,000. It's just extra. It's not part of this budget. It's extra. If the student had the highest average, so that means you need to calculate the highest average. So calculate the highest average. Average. Right? We need to calculate the highest average, which is simple. So I need to go through each and every single student, right? And calculate the average. So I need to start. Remember, we always assume that the first value is the highest average. So highest average is double because we store the average as a double. So students, the first student's average. Remember, we calculate the average. So dot calc calculate average, right? Oh no, remember it doesn't. I made it not to return anything. So I'm gonna calculate the first student's average, right? But I already calculated. Remember when we get the information from the user, we calculated the average. It's already stored. So it's fine. I can just retrieve it. It's stored. Keep that in mind. We did calculate. So dot average. But remember, this needs to be the first student, student number one. So we assume the first student is the one with the highest average. So before we do this, we actually need two for loops. We need to have a for loop that finds the highest student, right? The student with the highest average. So I need to say dim student as student. Okay, let's say the highest. Um, let's save the index of the highest, right? Let's make it that is easier, right? So integer is equals to 1. We assume the first one is the highest, the first student. And then the highest average, we assume the first average. Then I compare. If my previously assumed highest average happens to be less than this current average dot average, then I update my highest average. I now set it to that current student's average. But remember, we've already assumed the first student's average is the highest. So I need to start comparing from the second student. And then I update my index to be I. And then once I'm done, then now I can save to the file because I needed to find out the student with the highest average first. As integer is equals to 1 to n students, next I. So remember the index of the highest student to the highest average is stored inside index variable. So that's the position. So I need to check if the student qualifies. So students at index I dot qualifies is equals to true. Then I can save that student because you should they said you should what if you check properly, where is it? The save the student that will receive funding. So save only the students that receive the funding, meaning that you qualify. So qualify is equals to true, then that, and then but before we check if you qualify, this is a bit tricky. Let me see. Save all university students that will receive the funding to a random access file. So let me just double check something here. Remember, they told us to create a student record, right? So write a file that accepts a student object and writes the appropriate attributes, blah, blah, blah. Mm, mm, yeah, because they said you should only save the university students' information, right? But my question is, where are we going to put the, okay, average? Where are we going to put the, what is this? Where is it? Yeah, we don't save the funding, or maybe it's going to be dealt in a different way. I don't know. I don't know how we're going to handle the funding, the allocation of the funds, right? Because they put aside 1 million rands, and then it should, as funding, it should be split equally amongst the qualifying students. Mm, let me think, because they didn't tell you to save the funding. Yeah, you might lose a bit of marks there. The thing is, I don't want to spend too much time trying to solve that, but I do have an approach on how to approach that funding part. But yeah, I'm just going to save to the file and assume only save the ones that qualify. The funding part, I don't see where you're supposed to actually save the funding. But we do have that record structure, right? But the thing is, how are we going to link it to that student, right? That's where the problem is. So or maybe, but remember, they said you should, this was a different question. They said save the 18 student records here. But I think you should actually save the 18 student records. That's what I'm assuming. So that means they should just be 1 to 13. But I'm not going to get into into those details and trying to match those two things. So your code may depend on knowing how many objects exists in the random file. Your code must also cater for the possibility that no students were saved to the file. That is, there are no records in the random access file. Yeah, these people are not playing around, no? They are genuinely not playing around. Mm, okay, this is quite, might be a 3 hour video, around 3 hours there. But let's see, let me try to actually solve the problem. It's fine. So students that will receive the funding, oh no, it's fine. Remember what they said. They said save all the students that will receive the funding. The tricky part is when we read from the file, that's when you have to calculate the actual funding. That's the only time we calculate. So it's fine. I can just save it to the file. They say that will receive the funding. So let's save them to the file. So I need to call my write to file function. So write to file, which takes in a student, right? So write to file, which takes in a student object. So students at index I. And then it writes to the file. And then I'm done, right? And then after I'm done here, I need to output a message box. And I'm just going to say successfully um, wrote students who qualify for funding, to random access file. So we've saved them successfully into a random access file, the ones who qualify for funding. Remember, they didn't talk about that you should save the funding. They just said save the ones that do qualify. Then the following question, it requires you to reopen the random access file in question E to read the university objects, right? You may depend, your code may depend on knowing how many objects exist in the file. Yeah, it does depend on how many objects exist and things like that. So yeah, which is now I see what they're talking about. Remember, it depends on how many objects are written to the actual file. Remember, even though I'm going through all of the students, not all of them are being written. Why? Because I check if the student qualifies first. So they told you that so that yeah, this paper was not a joke. Like it was chowing. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna call it n records saved to file, which is this is very long. I'm gonna call it n saved or num. I'm gonna call it num saved, right, as integer. And then I'm just gonna initialize it to 0 here. It starts at 0 initially. And then when I save here, if it's true, if it happens to be true, right? If it happens to be true here, after writing to the file, I just increment num saved plus equals 1 to count so that I keep track of how many were saved in the file. Because they told you that your code will rely on the fact that it needs to know how many objects exist in the random access file, or else you go beyond the count of things that are inside the random access file, which is a problem. So at least they gave you that reminder. And then copy, do this, and then we need to read from the file again. So let's see. Your code must also cater for the possibility. And then once you're done reading, using the UJ grid, display the students that received funding. However, do not show the funding amount. So you see, funding amount didn't really matter in that, in terms of displaying on the UJ grid. But I think in the text box, they said, yeah. So let's see. So this needs to be changed from text. The text should be read from file. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep it simple. Just call it read from file. btn read from file. And then since we have students, right? Remember, this is a student-based application. It's mainly about students. So since it's mainly about student, I'm gonna give my grid a name since I'm gonna use it at some point. Yeah, this paper is really not a joke. So so the name, I'm gonna prefix it with GRD to denote that it's a grid. GRD students, right? And then keep that in mind and then save. Don't forget to save all your changes at the top. And then we need to read from the file, but we need to remember they told you, you need to know, where is it? Yeah, you need to know how many students were there. So they told you that your code may depend on knowing how many objects exist in the file. We called it num saved. So for I as integer is equals to 1 to num saved, and then next I. And remember that read from file function, it returns a student. That's read from file, it returns a student. Supposed to take in a student number. It is going to be tricky. Are we going to use the array to read, which makes no kind of makes no sense if you ask me. So the university, the Following question requires that you reopen the random access file saved in question E to read the university objects. You see plural objects. So we saved the file using that single array. Do we also use that single array to read from the file? Yeah, I guess that's pretty much what they want you to do, which is very weird, but yeah. So this will return a student, right? But so I'm gonna store it inside students I is equals to read from file. Then I need to pass in the student number. So students at index I dot student number, but remember it's a string. In our class, we saved it as a string, so I have to convert it to a integer. Then after I've read from the file, it gives me back a student object, right? But then they said, what should you do? Display those students that received the funding. They said your code must also cater for the possibility that no students were saved in the file. So how do we cater for that? It's basically num saved. It's a simple check, right? It's a simple check. I'll just do this. If num saved is greater than 0, that means at least one student was saved in the file. Therefore, I can read from the file. Else, that means it's less than or equals to 0, meaning that there's no student there. Therefore, I can just use a message box to make things simple and say no students were saved in the file. It's as simple as that. We've solved that part that you may assume that there might not be any records. So it's fine. And then using the UJ grid, display the students that received funding. So we must display students that received funding, right? So yeah, we need to go back to the fundamentals, back to Informatics 1A. So remember, we need to create a subroutine called place text. So public sub place. I hope I still, but it's not really a big deal. So row is integer, and then column call is integer, the column that we want to write it to, and then text is a string because that's the text we're writing to the grid. And then I've coded GDR students, right? Dot row is equal to that specific row, and then GRD students dot column is equal to that specific column, and then GRD students dot text is equal to that text that's being passed here. So we have our place text subroutine. So in terms of the number of rows and columns, we need to decide. So remember we have let's look at it based on the type of instance, right? But it's fine. Remember we have those common things. So let me see how many are there. So let's see. So we have, let me go back to my base class. So I have the full name, student number, then the marks array, which might be in quite a large number, an average and qualifies. So what I would do is I'll make every single row to be the information for each student. And then the columns will just represent that this is student one, student two, and so forth. So that means my columns is equals to my number of students. So let me initialize my UJ grid. So I'm going to say grd students dot rows in plural. I'm setting the rows. So the rows will be n students. Okay, not rows. I'll get to rows. So grd students dot calls, the columns, it's n students, right, plus one for the heading, right, for the 0 0 for column 0, that's the plus one. And then for the rows, we need to decide how many pieces of data are in each thing. So the first thing that we need to display is the full name. Which let's assume call it row 1, student number row 2. So that's 2 rows already. And then, okay, average and qualifiers, will put them after displaying the marks. So that's 2. Okay, 2, 4 plus this 2. So it's 4. And num marks. So the number of marks. So it's 4 plus the number of marks plus 1 for the zeroth row. So I need to find n marks here, right? I need to initialize it to n marks. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to do something that you were not really doing. So I'm going to initialize it within the for loop because the number of marks is stored in the array in part for each student. So I need to go through each student. So GRT students, which is going to be very weird. Sometimes because the rows and columns are different for each. It's fine. Oh, it's fine. It's only students. It's only university students. Okay, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. So yeah, it's fine. The number will be the same. So since the number will be the same, I know, remember they did tell me, I know the number of marks. Remember they did tell us in the beginning when we're getting the information. So for university, the number of marks is 2. So I need to actually use a 2. They did tell me. So it's fine. I was just overthinking it. So GRT students dot rows is 2 plus 4. Remember the 2 is the number of marks. And then the 4 is what is this? Those are 4 things that I need to store: full name, student number, average, and qualities. And qualifies, I mean. And then plus 1 for the heading, right? So this is 5, 7. So this is 7 rows, right? And then GRD, that means I need to put in the labels, right? So I need to say place text. But remember, there's multiple students, right? So I need to go through each student. So what I'm going to do, right? I'm trying to save code, right? I don't want to repeat writing for loops. So I'm going to put this there at the top. Once I've initialized my columns, then I can call place text here. While I'm reading from the file, I'm also placing the text and initializing the number of rows, putting labels for each row, whatever. So I need to pass in the row. So by default, it's going to be row 0. The only thing that's changing is column I. And then the text will be student followed by space, ampersand, followed by student number. What position? Student position, not number. And then once I've done that, now I can do what exactly? Yeah, now I can display the information. So, okay, before I do that, I need to put in okay, yeah, that's fine. So here, when it gets to the rows, I need to say place text. So let's start at the row. Okay, we can use row 0, right? Because that's the header. Yeah, I think you can use row 0. Yeah, if I'm mistaken, we can't say row 0. We have to say, oh, this is row 0, this is the label. It's fine. But here, when I'm actually displaying the text, 1. So row 1, which column? Okay, but I feel lazy to do this because I feel like, okay, it's fine. Let me just do it, but I feel lazy to do it because now I have to think about the placements of things. But I'm almost done. Let me just do it. So place text at row, what specific row? Mm, okay, row 1, column 0. Yeah. So row 1, column 0. And then what's the text? We're going to start by saying that's the full name, the heading for full name. And then what else? The student number. So underscore student number, it's row 2, student number. And then place text, column 3. Okay, it's no longer column 3, it's fine. Remember, from column 3 going upwards, I should be displaying what it's not, okay, it's not this. I'm mixing it up. That's a student. It's marks. So there's 2 marks, right? So this will just be column 3. I'll call this will be mark 1, and then column 4, mark 2, and then column 5 is average, and then column 6, which is the last one, it qualifies, right? It qualifies. And then that's pretty much it. Because for university, remember, there's no additional properties. So that's pretty much all I need. Then I'm done with, I have all my labels. And then while I'm setting my labels and all those things, I need to display the information, right? So place text at row 1, because remember, row 1 is what the full name, but column is column I. And then what's the text? Is the student's full name. So students at index I dot full name. I don't know how they expected to finish all of this in one sitting, but clearly you had to be able to finish it in one sitting. But yeah. And then index I. So let me just copy it this way so that I change a few things. And then students at index I dot student number. And then place text at index 3, row 3, I mean, okay. Yeah, it's fine. So the marks, the actual marks now. So I need to say students at index I dot marks at index 1. I can do that, but remember the array might not always be in that case. So I need to say for J as integer is equals to 1 to students at index I dot num marks, and then next J, because the array might not, in this case, yeah, you would have gotten your marks by saying, because you know it's exactly 2. But like I said, it's not always the case. So I need to start, remember, it starts from 2 going upwards, the number of marks. So I'm just going to say the row is 2 plus J. Remember, J starts at 1. So it's going to be, starts here as 2 plus 1, which is 3, which is mark 1, and then 2 plus 2, which is 4, which is mark 2, and so forth. But I'll just say 2 plus J, because you shouldn't put in the actual number of things, because it's not always going to be that number. So dot marks at index J. But remember, the third parameter for place text is a string, so I need to cast this to a string because I'm using option strict on. So my app is very strict. What else is missing? So let me copy this. And then at index, at row 4, no, row 5. Row 5, I need to put in the average. So dot average, but it's a string, the third parameter, so I need to convert that to a string. And then the last one is qualifies. So qualifies is a bit tricky because it's a Boolean, it's true or false. So I need to output yes or no. So I need to do a check. So if statement students at index I dot qualifies, if it qualifies, right, is equals to true. But remember, for you don't have to do this. Why you don't have to do this? Because they told you that in this question that you're only saving, they should save all the students that receive funding. That means the students that do qualify. So all of them do qualify. So under qualifies, right, which is at row 6, I should just output yes because they all do qualify for funding. So yes. And then done. That's how you display everything. Then you're done with everything, almost everything. Now we need to allocate the funding and then we'll be done. How many hours of, it's 3 hours already, okay. So using the UJ grid, do not show the funding amount. We didn't show that. Allow the user to specify a student number that you'll use to retrieve the record from the random access file and display their details. So you need to and display their details, including the funding amount in a message box. So the funding amount, it has to be calculated separate, right? So I need to come here and say, I need to calculate the funding amount for each student, which is going to be actually pretty straightforward if you think about it critically. So this would be display funding amount. So to get a funding amount for a specific student with a specific student number. So I'll say enter student number to retrieve funding. So they should enter a student number to get funding. So I'll call this btn get funding because it gets the funding. And then one last but not least, I need to have a text box. So text box, and I don't have to make it a multi-line, but since it might not really be visible, so I'll just make it a multi-line text box. And then do this. So there we go. So the person will enter their student number here, and then we store the student number, we check, we calculate that student number's funding, whatever. But let's do that. So we need to read from the file for that student using that student number, Remember the read from file function, it actually expects a student number. So that's fine. So I'm going to say dim. Okay, I might have done it wrong, but it's fine. It's fine. I might have done it wrong, but it's fine. But no, yeah. Okay, it's fine. Let me leave it. So it's not really wrong by wrong, but it's like there's a better way I could have done the specific question, but it's fine. I'm just gonna leave it because I don't want to confuse you guys. So dim student number as integer is equals to c int input box and then enter student number. And then once the users enter the student number, we're going to convert it to an integer, then store it into an integer. Then read from the file, but then the file is going to return back a student record. So uh, dim record as student. So we're going to get back a record, right? So I need to call the read from file function and pass that student number that I got from the user. And then once I've read the student from the file, I can calculate their funding, right? So how do we calculate funding? Remember, the money that's reserved is 1 million, right? So I need to find out how many students were stored, and which is a very easy thing to find. It's called num saved. To find an average for each student, I need to get the balance, which is the total. So I could do this, right? Let me see if I can. Thing is, I'm not that, I don't know a lot, everything inside. Yeah, I think I can. Yeah. So let me do this. So private const funding budget, right? As let me save it as an integer. But constants, it's a constant, right? It's const. I use const to say it's a constant value. But constant needs to be initialized to something. I think you can use an underscore. Yeah, you can use an underscore inside Visual Basic, just like in C Sharp, to make the number readable. So I'm making a constant to say that this is the funding budget. Because there's this thing called magic numbers. Magic numbers are not supposed to be, they're not allowed in your program. So that's the constant. I'm going to scroll down and then I'm going to calculate funding amount, right? So the amount for the student is, oh, remember I calculated I needed to calculate the highest average. So let me see, did I still have, yeah, I needed to calculate the highest average. See here. This is important. So what I'm going to do, right, this highest average, since I'm going to need it somewhere down there, I need to declare the variable at the top so that like it can be accessed by other functions. So dim index as integer, initialize it to 1 because initially we assume the first record is the one with the highest average. Then that index, then what I would do, right? I'll calculate the students, what is this? The students amount, right? Funding amount. So I'm going to say, call it amount as double because I'm going to divide, obviously. So I'm going to take the funding budget, the actual budget divided by the number of saved students in the file. Then I get an average for each. Then I need to go through, remember, I need to know whether the student was actually the highest so that I have an accurate amount. If he was the one with the highest average, who basically was number one in class, therefore he deserves an extra 10,000. So I need to do that. So okay, it's num saved. Based, I go through all the number of students that were saved in the file. Then I check if students, okay, if I, right, if that specific index I is equal to that student number that I got from the user, then I know I found that file I found the student number that I'm looking for. But at the same time, and that student happens to be the student with the highest average. How do I find that? Remember, I stored the position of the student with the highest average inside the variable called index. So I has to be equal to both things, the student number from the user and the index, meaning that the student is the highest. So that's why I'm going to structure it in this way. And then I'm just going to put brackets to make it easy to read or to understand what's the flow. So if this student happens to be the highest student, then obviously the amount I need to add an extra 10K to their balance. To their balance. Balance. So that means amount, the current amount plus equals 10,000. But then remember, this is what we call magic numbers. In the future, you won't know what 10,000 actually means. So 10,000, it's an additional 10K to the base amount, but it's fine. Only this time I won't make it a constant. It's fine. Then once I'm done, that text box, I needed to rename it. I forgot to rename it, to give it a name. So TXT, should we call TXT what? So this is TXT funding amount, right? So I'm gonna call it TXT funding because this is where I display the funding amount. So TXT funding. So TXT funding dot text is equals to, I need to output the R letter in the, so that they know it's in rands. But then I also need to round off that amount because it might be a very long number. I want to round it off up to 2 decimal places. And then once I've done that, everything has been solved 100%. So we did everything, including the funding amount in they said in a message box, my bad. They said message box. So the only difference is message box. So I'm gonna copy from R, cut that, and then just say MSG box, this. And then done. Or I could just, so since it's a message box, I need to say this is a funding amount like this so that it shows that this is actually a funding amount. So that means the text box is no longer needed. Then that's pretty much all you had to do for your practical, for this practical. It was a bit, for this semester test, it was a bit complex. I'm not going to lie to you, but yeah, practice makes perfect. So if this is what you guys should expect, I suggest you go study thoroughly. So yeah, that's it for today's tutorial. Yeah, and that's it for today's tutorial. I guess that's pretty much it because I don't think I'll upload another video, but yeah, good luck, all the best on Friday.